Have any of you ever thought very deeply about what it means to be a really good accountant? I promise we're going somewhere with this. You're not in the wrong room. I'm not in the wrong room. We're all good. So, as you can maybe tell by my last name, my father is a stubborn old Italian guy, and for years and years he has insisted on doing his own taxes. However unqualified he is, however little he knows about it, it's always been his thing to do it himself. And finally, as he's gotten older, he decided it wasn't worth his time. He's going to hire a professional. Well, that's great. So he hires an accountant, and this person does a perfectly good job doing his taxes, but my father talks about him absolutely all the time. And the reason that he talks about him all the time is not because he did a competent job of preparing his taxes, but because my father's accountant used to be a lawyer. And while it is certainly not a prerequisite to being a good accountant, being a lawyer has made him very helpful to my father. He has legal knowledge outside of just tax law, so he can expand that out into different situations. He's a confident communicator, and those are all things that he learned in his legal career. And so, of course, it wasn't required for him to have been a lawyer to be a good accountant, but he did learn a lot of valuable skills that made my father rave about him over and over and over again. And that's what we're here to talk about today. We're here to talk about career changing and why it's valuable. And I have a couple of facts that might surprise you. Career changing is actually very, very common. In March of 2021, so just a few years ago, Prudential did a survey that showed that 1 in 5 American workers had made a career change in the previous year. So that means it's highly likely that one of the people around you has worked in another industry. And one more. This one's a little bit harder to measure or to back up with data, but it's commonly thrown around that the average person has 5 to 7 careers in their lifetime. The reason that this is difficult to measure is because people define different careers in different ways. But in my own experience, I am on my 3rd career. I've been a musician, I've been a bank manager, and now I work in engineering. And I'm probably less than halfway through my working life. I've always wanted to be a lawyer since I was a teenager, and in my mid-30s, I don't think that's out of the question for me in the future. And maybe that implies that someday I would also make a really good accountant. Now, in spite of how common this situation is, we do not do a good job of recognizing the value of career changing specifically in tech for whatever reason. In this industry, we are consistently encouraged to downplay any non-engineering experience we've had. Or worse, we're told to just forget about them entirely, put it behind you. But the truth is that some of the most critical and valued skills that any engineer has can be learned outside of an engineering degree or outside of an engineering role. So we need to care about this non-technical experience. Because just like our friend the accountant, anyone with a previous career has transferable skills that everyone around them should be grateful for. So let's take a step back for a moment, if you don't believe me. Before we talk about specific transferable skills, let's talk about what makes a great engineer. So in preparation for this talk, I used the most scientific method I could think of to gather information, which was a Twitter poll. Of course, when I did this, it was actually still called Twitter. And the reason that I did this is because, yes, as a manager, as an engineer, I have my own opinion about what makes a great software engineer, but I wanted to make sure that I wasn't really just centering my own thoughts. So I asked my followers, who was the best engineer you ever worked with, and what made them the best? And I actually received a pretty representative group of responses, and what I mean by that is it wasn't just from engineers. I also got responses from product managers, from designers, from leaders at different levels, and there were a lot of common themes in what they said. So let's take a look at those. The first response I got was from a product leader who talked about an engineer who over-communicated to keep others in the loop, who collaborated well, and who was proactive in their approach to their work. The next 2 responses came from fellow engineers. The first one mentions kindness, communication, and deep expertise in their area of specialization. And another mentions an engineer who doesn't expect everyone to know what they know, and the subtext there is that they probably do know a lot. And that means that that engineer probably has empathy not only for how hard it is to learn, but also the ability to communicate that empathy to other people and let them know that they understand that they don't know everything and that it's okay. I also got 2 responses from engineering leaders at different levels. The first one mentioned something we heard about already, which is thoughtful and intentional communication, and then goes on to talk about the engineer's ability to teach and help others, and also about their pragmatism, which is the ability to recognize what's practical in a given situation. Our other engineering leader echoes the sentiment that helping others improve is really important, and also notes that the engineer they thought of was also skilled at receiving feedback and making themselves a better engineer. And lastly, I got a response from a designer who, again, highlighted the ability to help and develop others, and the strategies that they used, like pairing and no dumb question statements, to make an inclusive environment. All of these things are non-technical. And that was the thing that stood out to me the most. Everything that was mentioned here could have been learned in a non-engineering context. And those skills did fall into a few broad categories, which I will break down here, because I think it's valuable to use this later on. The first one was communication. And that doesn't surprise me at all that this would come up first in all of these responses. Effective engineers, except for in very rare cases, are working on teams, and they have to communicate with product, they have to communicate with design, they have to communicate with engineers on their own team, with engineers on other teams, with engineers in the broader community like we're doing here today. And the nuances of communication were also mentioned a lot and were important. There was a heavy emphasis on kindness, empathy, being proactive, communicating the right information at the right time, and being collaborative. There were also a lot of allusions to the ability to improve and to do that in different ways. And these can all be attributed to a growth mindset. And you might be wondering like what exactly that means, but first let's talk about the specific things from the Twitter thread. The examples we reviewed don't only mention knowledge, but the capacity to learn new things, to accept feedback, to help other people learn. And growth mindset, which was, as far as I know, first coined by Carol Dweck in her book, Mindset, great title. It's the belief that one can improve by dedicating time, effort, and energy. And she elaborates further that those with growth mindsets embrace challenges, persist through obstacles, learn from criticism, and are inspired by the success of others. This sounds a lot like the people that we talked about on the Twitter thread as well, and it's a good framing for a broad set of competencies that you might want out of an engineer. And lastly, our examples indicated engineers who are leaders. And that doesn't mean they're tech leads or managers, or even that they're in any kind of formal leadership role at all. What it means is that they lead on their teams by making others feel included, by being pragmatic and not just advocating for a refactor because they want to try that new front-end framework, and by mentoring other people. So we know what all those skills are, and you might be thinking like, okay, but how does this apply to me, and what does it have to do with career changing? And we will talk about practical strategies in a bit, but I also want to share some stories because I think these connections were really hard for me to make personally, and I want to talk about that a little bit. So again, let's go back to my career as a musician, and we'll start with a story about growth mindset. I studied, when I was a musician, clarinet performance. And I was passionate about being on stage, which might be a thing that's still going on. And the reason I bring that up is because I didn't want to be a music teacher. I didn't want to be a music therapist. I wanted to perform. And that's one of the hardest and most competitive things that you can do in music. You have to work really hard. You have to dedicate your time to developing skills, to practicing, to becoming better at your instrument. And through that, I learned a lot of different strategies for becoming a better clarinetist. if I had a difficult piece of music, I was told to play that passage backwards, to play it 3 times correctly in a row so that I knew that I could repeat that physical act. And also using knowledge of music theory that I had been studying to be able to break things down into smaller components that I understood well, like scales. So fast forward some years, and I had made the decision to go to a software engineering boot camp and make this my new career after a lot of failed music auditions and whatnot. And I had absolutely no previous knowledge. I basically taught myself enough to pass the admissions interview for this boot camp. And then they gave us like a huge pre-work thing that we had to do before we started the program. And it was really hard. Or it was really hard for me at that time. And it was so hard, in fact, that even after quitting my job, putting down a pretty serious monetary deposit and dedicating a lot of energy to this, I was ready to quit and go back to doing something else. But it was at that point that I actually realized that I had learned some things studying music that would help me in this situation. And I'm not going to go as far as to make like very direct comparisons between these things, but as many of us know, especially when studying things like algorithms, repetition is helpful. Breaking down the problem is helpful. And when I was able to think about those things in that way and understand that I already had those skills, I was able to kind of engage with that growth mindset and tell myself, I can learn this, I can do this, and I'm ready to move forward. Growth mindset also, as I mentioned, requires the belief that you can learn and succeed. And sometimes that's a really hard thing to do. And rejection is very, very common in the music world, and it's something that comes up for us too. There's actually a really long New York Times piece in which the author tracks down the instrumentalists from the Juilliard class of 1994. And Juilliard is probably the premier conservatory, at least in the US, and it has some recognition around the world. Going to Juilliard is a very big deal. 25% of those 1994 Juilliard graduates are working professionally as musicians. That's 1 in 4 graduates of one of the premier conservatories in the world. That's a lot of rejection and has forced people out of that industry in some cases. And it's just unfortunately true that most auditions a musician will take, they won't get the gig. And a lot of the time, it's not because they're not good. It's because of a lack of alignment. Because music is very open to interpretation. Whoever's conducting your audition might decide that your sound isn't compatible with the group, or that your interpretation of the music doesn't quite align with the conductor's, and that you wouldn't be a good fit for that specific job. And so as a musician, in order to cope and have any semblance of mental health, I really needed to be able to understand that and say, okay, a rejection is not commentary on my ability. It's a reflection that this just wasn't the thing for me. And I'm not going to say that was easy, and I'm not going to say I was always successful, but I did my best, and it was really something that I focused on. And this one was really hard to bring into my career as an engineer. When I first started, and I was looking for my first job, I did kind of take the rejection thing and say, like, okay, I know there's going to be a lot of rejection here, I'm just starting out, and that's okay. But as I moved on in my career, it came up again. And it's important to note that in engineering, like, we are kind of looking for alignment as well. It's not all just about skills, right? You're looking for someone who's excited about the product you're working on, maybe, or you're looking for somebody who's able to work on a small team or in a large company. I've done both of those things, and they are very, very different. So a few years ago, I interviewed for a role as an engineering manager of a front-end team. And I had heard great things about this company. I thought I would be really qualified because as an IC, front-end was what I did the most. And I was just really excited about this job. And as I started interviewing, I got a little bit of signal that maybe what I was looking for and what they were looking for were kind of different things. Because while they expressed that they wanted a people leader, The interviews didn't bring that up at all. And while they had made it clear that they wanted a front-end specialist, which I was, they didn't actually bring up until the interviews that they also wanted someone who I would say was along the lines of a principal architect. And that wasn't me anymore, and that wasn't the job I was looking for. But I continued through the interview process, and I thought I did really well. And they rejected me. And I felt like a failure. I felt like even though I had put so much work into my career as a manager, into my career as an engineer, they couldn't see it. And that meant that I had done something wrong. And then I kind of remembered this thread from my career as a musician, and I realized that if they had hired me for that job, they would have been doing a disservice both to me and to the company, because I wasn't what they were looking for, and that job was not what I was looking for. It's not the kind of thing that would have made me feel fulfilled, and I wouldn't have been good at it. And I'll cover one more story, and then we'll get into some tactical things. We talked a little bit about mentorship in the Twitter examples. I am definitely not going to stand here and tell you that every music teacher I had showed me great methods for teaching and mentoring. The music world is known for being really harsh and not tactful at all. But what I wanted to mention here was, after I graduated, I really focused on teaching young students. I had not gotten a good foundation. My first clarinet teacher was a saxophone player. And while he taught me a lot of good things, there were a lot of things he just didn't know enough to bring up to me. So I really felt passionate about, okay, if I can give these young kids a good foundation, they can have a lot of success. But teaching young kids is kind of difficult. Bad habits are hard to break, but it's also very hard to tell an 8-year-old that they're going to care about something in 10 years. If you do this right now, I promise it will pay off when you're 18. It's really hard to get that through. One of the first students I was teaching was doing really well, but he was struggling with his hand position. He was really tense while he was holding his instrument, and I knew from my own experience that if he wasn't able to correct that, and if that habit cemented itself over time, it would lead to issues with tone quality, it would lead to him not being able to have the dexterity to play fast passages, so I wanted to fix this. But I also was keeping in mind the fact that if I was overly critical, I would discourage him completely, and that I had to kind of look at it through his eyes. So I decided not to bring it up every time. I decided to bring it up at very critical moments. And sometimes I wouldn't even say, hey, you're doing that wrong. I would say, why don't you try this? See how you feel about it. And he was able to make that correction and ended up playing all the way through high school and was very successful. And the thing that I learned from one of my teachers that made me be able to do that effectively was actually a quote from Pope John the 23rd, and it's, see everything, overlook a great deal, correct a little. And I had a mentor in one of my front-end roles who did this really well too. And this is more of a story about someone else than it is about me, except that I was the person receiving the feedback. I was pretty early in my career. We had just hired this front-end engineer. He had a ton of experience. He was super talented. We didn't know each other at all. And so naturally, I felt nervous when he was doing PR reviews. I was like, this guy's great, and now he's looking at my work. And because I was so early in my career, I'm sure he looked at it and saw a lot of things that he wanted to correct, but he was very good at doing this. And so in every PR review, he would make some corrections, but only the most important ones. Sometimes he'd make some other suggestions, but he would be very, very clear, like, this is a nit, or this is just a suggestion. And he would also make sure to include a compliment, and they were genuine compliments to, like, things that I could really latch onto and started to build my confidence. And so I was able to kind of like translate it back to this thing that I had done myself, and now that I am in a role to be able to mentor other people, I try to keep that in mind all the time. We don't want to discourage people. So if any of that resonated with you, you might be thinking like, okay, but what do I do now, right? Like, I changed careers and I want to be able to articulate the value of my own experience, or I think this is really important in our industry, but I don't know how to help. So we'll talk about first some strategies for individuals and then some strategies for teams. This is really hard to do because we don't do it a lot. We don't talk about it. For me, I had kind of that one realization early on about rejection and then started to build my thinking around it over time. And again, because this is so actively discouraged, I kind of alluded to this before, but when I graduated from my boot camp, I was encouraged to justify my career change by like making a very well-crafted story about it, talking about it in interviews, and then never bringing it up again. And it really made me unsure because I was like, well, do I belong? Am I bringing anything to the table that anybody is going to find valuable beyond like 12 weeks of JavaScript knowledge, right? That's not a really confidence-building kind of thing. So as much as I love my boot camp, that's really bad and unhelpful advice, and I don't think this is the kind of thing that we should push to the side. So the first thing I would encourage you to do, if this resonates with you, is to do some intentional reflection, and maybe not do it over the course of like 8 years like I did. Think about what experiences you've had outside of tech. What did you like about it? What were you good at? And what kinds of skills do you have that are either being underutilized or that you're not talking about enough? And I know this can feel overwhelming. You might be looking at like the totality of your life up to that point and trying to do something with it. But we did talk about 3 general themes that make a really good engineer. So if you don't know where to start, that could be a good place: communication, leadership, growth mindset. And I'm not saying that's a comprehensive list of what might make you good at your job, but they're pretty universal and a pretty good place to start. And from there, you can branch out into other areas. And none of that is going to become clear overnight, but being able to stop and think about it is a good start. After you've thought about that a little bit, I would encourage you to have a conversation with your manager. If you have like a really clear job description or a competency matrix or a career ladder, this will be a lot easier. But we can talk about that more in a bit. And your goal here is to create alignment. You want to highlight what skills you think you have, how they're valuable on your team, what kinds of things you want to work on, and make sure that your manager is just in agreement, like, yes, these are things that we want on our team. Any well-intentioned manager will be really grateful that you've had this time to deeply think about your career and your role, how you can progress, and how you can help your team. And then don't downplay your technical experience. Sorry, I'm a little lost in my slides here. This one is probably the most difficult, or I know it was for me. For all the reasons we discussed, bringing this up can be kind of uncomfortable. Maybe it feels like it doesn't make sense. But you should lean into it as much as you can. And when it's appropriate, talk about things you've done in the past that feel relevant to something you're doing in the present. Do that in interviews. Don't be, do it at work. Don't be afraid to show people what you're good at. And if you don't believe me, I do really think it is impressive to have accomplishments outside of your current career. My first reaction to hearing that my dad's accountant was a lawyer was not to question his ability as an accountant. I thought to myself, wow, what a great accomplishment it is to have studied 2 really difficult fields and succeeded at them. And I don't think anybody else would view this any other way in tech. I would also like to talk a little bit about some strategies for teams. I do acknowledge that everybody in this room is probably in a different place for this. So if you're in a leadership role, you might be able to influence it directly. If you're an individual contributor, it might be more like making suggestions. But they are things to keep in mind over time. And like it was mentioned in the previous talk, this is a journey. This isn't the kind of thing that's going to change overnight. So being able to keep at it is really important. All of this stuff really starts when we're hiring people and continues through the entire life cycle of the job. So the first thing your company can do is craft job descriptions thoughtfully. You want your job descriptions to reflect the skills that are actually useful. And as a part of this exercise, you want to make sure you don't have job postings that look like this. So this one starts out with a computer science degree as the first desired skill. And the last one is, or sorry, second to last, outstanding interpersonal and communication skills, which is not the order in which things came up when we asked about what makes a good engineer. Or this one, which is kind enough to mention equivalent practical experience in lieu of a degree, but it doesn't say anything about anything other than technical skills anywhere down the job description. So unless you would be this company's first engineer working completely by yourself, spoiler alert, I pulled this from a huge company's website, you'll probably need to be good at working with others. And a good job description can also have practical applications afterward. If you don't have some of the other frameworks that we're going to talk about, it is something you can refer back to as like a good example of like what kind of skills you should be building and working on over time. The other thing your company can do is make soft skills promotable, but I hate the term soft skills, but there's like no other language for it. You know, you're gonna wanna make sure that, yes, our Twitter thread indicates that lots of people think this way, but you also want to make sure that like it's actually valued at the company that you're working at. I really like career ladders or competency matrices for this reason. They do have some drawbacks, but it makes it very clear what kinds of things you want an engineer to be able to do, and often that line of thinking will lead to things that are explicitly like communication and leadership. At the Times, we have 4 different buckets: technical skill, effectiveness, communication, and leadership. So again, only one of those things kind of brings up specifically technical things all the time. And if you're not in a place to implement this yourself, again, it can be helpful to make that suggestion. There are a lot of great examples out there in the world. I used to work for Circle CI. I think they were one of the first companies to publish theirs online. I believe it's still up. I think it's pretty good. And then also, you're going to want to make your interview processes more comprehensive. Make sure you're asking candidates questions about non-technical skills that your organization values, like communication. And again, this can like come up in technical exercises too. If you're asking someone to do a PR review as part of an interview, that can signal how they do at communication. If you're asking them to do a pairing exercise, that might be an indicator of how they collaborate. So it doesn't have to necessarily be like a full-on soft skills interview. I did have a much longer talk about this thing specifically, so if you want some resources, you can feel free to check out that link at the bottom, and I'll share it later on as well. And one other thing you can do for your whole team, for your whole company, is to encourage others. There have been so many times in my career where hearing this kind of thing from other people has really propped me up and made me ready to carry forward. And I know this seems small, but you can really challenge yourself to do this. And if a compliment feels empty, you could also do something like ask a question like, hey, you did a really good job leading that meeting. Where did you learn how to do that? And that'll make people feel really valued in those areas as well. I know that it's really important for your confidence to come from within, but it also helps to have the support of your coworkers. So I hope some of this resonated with you. And my call to action is for all of us to bring this mindset that non-technical experience is valuable back to the jobs that we do every day. And I'll tell you one more short story if you need a last little bit of convincing. As part of my tech career, again, I've done a lot of speaking. And one of the conferences that I worked with a while back connected me with a speaking coach. And she's amazing. And one of the first things that she told me is that she had a previous career as an actress. She was a theater major. And I had never really thought about it before, but it makes a ton of sense. Public speaking is not just about your knowledge of the material. It's about your ability to communicate clearly, your ability to organize your thoughts, and also your ability to present yourself to an audience, which is a lot like acting. And that made her, that experience that she had as an actress, made her a much, much better speaking coach, and I hope that it has made me a better speaker, and that is an example of the impact that that kind of thing can have moving through different people's careers. Thank you very much. The slides are available as well as kind of like an outline format notes thing if you would like it. Really appreciate your time.